Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to knit the Sea Spray tee. So the first thing you'll need for this project is the free written pattern, which you can get by clicking the first link in the description box down below. Or you can grab the ad-free PDF version of the pattern by clicking the second link in the description box down below. Now, of course, the next step once you have the written pattern is to choose the size. So you want to choose the size that is closest to the wearer's bust measurement, and all the information for all the different sizes is included in the pattern. This pattern comes in 9 sizes from a women's extra small to a 5X. And once you've chosen a size, then you need to get some yarn. Now I'm using Knit Picks Lindy Chain. And this yarn is a fingering weight yarn. It's a blend of linen and Pima cotton. But not only that, it's also a chainette yarn. So that means that the yarn is not twisted and spun together. Instead, the different strands of the yarn are joined together in a way that's kind of like either a chain stitch or a very narrow I-cord, if you're familiar with I-cord. So that's what makes the texture of this yarn. And chainette yarns tend to have a very smooth, lovely texture. And this particular yarn, being a blend of linen and Pima cotton, has a very crisp, distinct texture to it, but it's also very subtle. So I have several skeins of this, and the colorway I'm using is called Sagebrush. Here's a sample of the fabric that this project is going to be made from. And you can see that we are using this fingering weight chainette yarn with much larger needles than you would normally use with a fingering weight yarn. But what that is giving us is this very loose, delicate texture, and that's what we want. This is a very lightweight garment, and I really like the drape of this material. So what we're going to be doing is using that much larger needle size to give us a looser gauge, which will in turn make the fabric drape beautifully. So speaking of needle size, you're going to need a US size 8 knitting needle. Now I'm using a circular needle because that is my preference. You can use straight needles, but I prefer to use circular needles for any kind of larger sized panels because they give more room for the knitting to sit on the needle. And I also prefer to not have the long ends of straight knitting needles wiggling around as I'm knitting. So I recommend circular needles for this, but you can try to squeeze all the stitches onto straight needles and use straight needles if you want to, because we're not actually working in the round. We're making 2 rectangles. That's it. They're very simple to make, very simple stitches. This is very beginner friendly. So we're going to be working back and forth on the circular needles. So you'll also need a measuring tape, some scissors, and a yarn needle or blunt tapestry needle. I like these chibi ones because they have a bent tip, which is my preference for a yarn needle. And now that you have all of your supplies, we can get started with the knitting. As I mentioned earlier, we are going to be making essentially 2 rectangles, one for the front and one for the back. And so we're going to start by casting on at the bottom edge of our rectangle. And you can use whatever cast on that you like. I'm just going to go ahead and use the long tail cast on. But you want to leave an even longer tail than usual because we are going to be using what's left of this yarn tail to sew up the side seams. So I'm leaving a very, very long tail. And I'm going to begin casting on with the long tail cast on. Now I'm going to be making the extra small. So for the extra small, I'm going to cast on 84 stitches. And if you're making one of the other sizes, you'll want to check the pattern instructions to see how many stitches you need. Now, I'm just going to hold this extra needle out of the way so that it's not sliding around, but I'm going to cast on until I have a total of 84 stitches, and I should still have a pretty good length of yarn tail left when I'm finished with the cast on, because we want to save some yarn tail length for the seam, and that's why we allowed extra length in that yarn tail. Alright, so you can see that I finished casting on here. My stitches are kind of squished together on the needle, so they don't look as wide as they actually are. But we are now ready to move on to the knitting. So I've kind of rolled up my long yarn tail that we're going to save for the seam later, just to keep it out of the way. And for rows 1 to 6, we are just going to knit every stitch all the way across. We're just going to do 6 rows of garter stitch, which is to knit every stitch on every row. So I am going to just continue to knit every stitch across for 6 rows total, and then I will show you how we're going to move on to the rest of the stitch pattern. Alright, so I have my first 6 rows of knitting, and this is kind of our edging, if you will, along the bottom edge of our T. So now we're going to move into the stitch pattern, which is very simple. It only involves knitting and purling, so very beginner friendly. And what we're going to do is for row 7, we are just going to knit every stitch all the way across. Alright, so that was row 7. I just knit all the way across, and now for row 8, we are going to kind of make a little bit of stockinette stitch here. So we're going to knit the first stitch, and then we're going to purl all the rest of the stitches across until we have 1 stitch left in the row. Alright, we're down to the last stitch. We're going to knit the last stitch. So we basically had a purl row, except we knit the first stitch and the last stitch, and that's the end of row 8. So you can see that little bit of stockinette stitch starting to form right there. So for row 9, we're going to repeat row 7 and knit all the way across. And then for row 10, we're going to repeat row 8 and purl across, except for knitting the first and last stitches of the row. So I'm going to go ahead and work rows 9 and 10, and then I'll show you how to work the next rows. Alright, so we have a few rows of stockinette stitch now, and now we're going to add a couple rows of knits and purls, and that's going to give kind of a bumpy textured line that runs across the fabric. So for row 11, we're going to knit the first stitch because we have kind of an edge stitch that we're going to be running along both sides of our panel. Then we're going to knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, all the way across until we have 1 stitch left on the needle. Alright, so I'm to the last stitch, and I'm going to knit that last stitch. So that's the end of row 11, and for row 12, we're going to turn, and we're going to knit the first stitch. That's our edge stitch again. And on this row, we are going to purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, all the way across until we have 1 stitch left in the row. Alright, there's that last stitch, and we're going to knit the last stitch. So that is the end of our stitch pattern repeat, and you can't really see the textured line very well yet because we don't have any more stockinette stitch above it, but we're going to very shortly. So what we're going to do next is we're going to repeat rows 7 to 12 a bunch more times depending on which size you're making to get most of the length that we need for our panel. So for the size that I'm making, I need to repeat rows 7 to 12 21 more times for the extra small. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, repeat it that many more times, and then I'll show you what it looks like and what we'll do next to finish off our panel. Alright, so I have finished repeating all of those rows, the correct number of times for the size that I'm making. So the next step is to repeat rows 7 to 10 one more time, and then I'm going to repeat rows 1 to 6 one more time. And what that will do is that you can kind of see right here, we have our last few rows. Those are the last line of knits and purls right across here. So we're going to work a few more rows of just plain stockinette stitch, which is rows 7 to 10, and then we're going to work rows 1 to 6 again, which will give us another garter stitch edging along the top. So I'm going to go ahead and work those rows and then show you what it looks like and what we'll do to finish off our panel. But real quick, I just wanted to show you how fluid and delicate this fabric is because we are using a fingering weight yarn and working it at a larger gauge. The material that we're creating is very open and airy and delicate. And this is the perfect type of feel for a summer project. Now you can kind of see that on my piece the edges are curling just a little bit because this has not been blocked, but with a very loose gauge like this it's not very difficult to block out the curl in these edges. So when we're finished, these edges after they are blocked will lay nice and flat and smooth. So I'm going to repeat rows 7 to 10 one more time and rows 1 to 6 one more time, and then I'll show you how we're going to bind off. Alright, so I have finished repeating those rows, and you can see how that we have our garter stitch edging at the top now. And what we're going to do to finish this off is we're going to bind off all the way across our top edge. Now I'm just going to be using the kind of standard bind off, but the method that I have in my how to bind off loosely video will also work for this, especially if you have a tight bind off. So if you are a person that has a harder time binding off loosely, go ahead and go check out that video. I will put a link to that in the description box. It's very similar to the regular standard bind off. So I'm just going to bind off all the way across this edge, and then we will tie off. Alright, so I've bound off all of the stitches down to the very last one that's on my needle. So I'm going to leave a tail for seaming the shoulder, and I'm just going to leave it about 12 inches long to make sure that I have enough length for that seam. Then I'm going to cut my yarn and pull the loop on the needle until the tail comes all the way out. So that is our first panel, and what we're going to do is I'm going to repeat all of the instructions for this panel to make the second panel because they're both exactly the same, and then we're going to block our pieces. Alright, so I finished knitting both my front and back panels. So the next step before we start assembling our top is to block our panels. Now if you're not familiar with blocking, I have a whole video on how to block your projects, and I'll link that in the description box down below. But blocking is a step that I highly recommend for most all projects because it really helps relax the fabric and give it the best drape and feel that it can have for whatever fiber content you're using. And this particular yarn is natural fiber. It is cotton and linen. So I'm going to wet block or spray block, either way, my pieces here. So what that means is I'm going to get them wet either by putting them into water and then squeezing out the extra gently, or by pinning them out first and then spraying them. But regardless, they're going to be made wet and then spread out on blocking mats and pinned to the mats. And blocking mats are just made of foam. So what you want to do is as you pin these out, make sure that they are pinned to the finished measurements of the rectangles given in the pattern. And you also want to make sure that the edges are not curling and that the edges of the sides of all of your pieces are pinned down at square angles. So you don't want this kind of pulled funny so that it looks almost angled crooked compared to the one at the bottom edge here. We want to pin everything out at square angles and with the edges uncurled. Now because this fabric is already so relaxed and so loose, we don't have to worry about the curl on the edge of the panels because this little tiny bit of curl will block right out, which will help flatten out the edge and make the edge very neat. So I'm going to go ahead and block my panels, and I should also mention that before you do this, because of the nature of this fabric, because we are working at such a loose gauge, there may be a few stitches here and there that are a little extra loose and might leave the appearance of a small hole in the fabric. So if you see any really loose stitches that you don't want to be there, what you can do is take your knitting needles or a yarn needle and just stretch the stitches on either side of the loose one to kind of even out that extra slack in the loose stitch. And that will help neaten it up and make sure that it doesn't look like a hole. So I'm going to go ahead and block both of my panels on my blocking mats with the wet block method as shown in my blocking video, and then we will get started with the seaming. Alright, so both of my panels are all blocked now. You can see they have this lovely drape to them. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to start by sewing up the side seams. So first of all, we're going to take one panel and we're going to lay it face down so that the wrong side is facing down on the table, like so. And I do have some tails left to weave in, but I'm just going to show you real quick how we're going to do the seams before I weave in the ends. So now we have this first panel laying face up. I have the cast on edge down here at the bottom, and then we're going to take our second panel and lay it on top. And we want, again, the cast on edge at the bottom, and we just want to kind of line up all of these edges. So once we've lined up our pieces like this, we should have several yarn tails. We should have a long yarn tail at each bottom corner of our piece, and we should have a short yarn tail at each top corner. So we're going to start at the bottom, and I'm actually going to start over here on this side. And I'm going to grab the long yarn tail from the corner of this piece down here. So I'm going to take the yarn tail here and thread it into my yarn needle. And we're going to start sewing up the side seam. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to sew the front and back side edges of our panels together and stop at a certain point to leave an opening for the armhole. Now for the size that I'm making, I'm supposed to stop when I have 6.5 inches left between the end of my seam and the top corner up here. So what we're going to do is we are going to either whip stitch or mattress stitch these two edges together. Now I generally prefer to mattress stitch. So if you're not familiar with mattress stitch, I do have a tutorial on that in my channel. You can go check that out. I will link that in the description box. But mattress stitch is just to go in between the stitch columns to pick up your strands of yarn that are going to join to the other side. And the mattress stitch creates a seam that is nearly invisible. So we're going to just kind of hide that seam by doing it in mattress stitch. All right, so I got to the end of the garter stitch band down here at the bottom. And now I'm going to go in between the very edge stitch and the next stitch column. And I'm picking up two of the horizontal strands of yarn that go in between those two columns of stitches on this side. Then I'm going to come back over here to where my needle came out on this side before and pick up the next two horizontal strands between the very edge stitch column and the next stitch column to it. And this is essentially what I'm going to be doing all the way up. I'm going to come back to where I came out on this side and then pick up between the next two stitch columns so that I have two horizontal strands on my needle, and then come back here on this side and do the same thing over here. So again, I've got two horizontal strands of yarn on this side. So I am going to try to keep this seam as flat and smooth as possible. You can see how it kind of disappears so far. And just to make sure that it doesn't get bunched up, every few inches you just want to kind of give the seam itself a little lengthwise tug to make sure that you're not pulling it too tight like this. So we just kind of give it a lengthwise tug to flatten it out, smooth it out, and that will make a very neat seam that kind of just disappears into the T here. So I'm going to continue mattress stitching until I get to the point where I'm supposed to stop for the size that I'm making. So for the extra small, I need to stop mattress stitching when I have 6.5 inches left between the top corner of the panel and where I'm at with the end of the seam. So I'm just going to keep mattress stitching these two edges together until I have 6.5 inches left in that armhole space, and then we're going to tie off and do the shoulder seam. Alright, so I have made it to the point where I have 6.5 inches left before the top corner. So I'm just going to take my yarn needle, bring it back into the inside of the opposite edge that from what I just came out of. Then I can come to the inside of that seam and pick up a couple strands of yarn right next to where my yarn is coming out. Make a knot by wrapping the yarn around the needle a couple times and pull it through. And I'm going to pull it fairly tight. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut the extra yarn, leaving a tail so that I can weave that in later. But first I want to show you how we're doing the shoulder seam. So that was our side seam, and you can see how the seam just kind of disappears and blends right in with the fabric, which I really love that about mattress stitch. It's one of the best seaming techniques for when you don't want to see the seam at all. So that is our first side seam. Now I'm going to come up here to the top and do the shoulder seam. So as you can see at this top corner between the two panels, I have a long yarn tail that's, a little longer than you would normally have if you were just going to weave it in, but long enough that we can add a bit of a shoulder seam to this top edge. So I'm going to thread this tail into my yarn needle, and we are just going to stitch these two edges together until the seam is the correct length for the size that we're making. So for this particular edge right here, I am going to choose to use a whip stitch, just because we have two bind off edges here, and although mattress stitch can be done on a bind off edge, it's just a little bit more difficult to see where you're putting the needle. So I'm just going to whip stitch these two edges of the T together until my seam is 4 inches long for the size that I'm making, but check the pattern to know how long it should be for whatever size that you're making. So I'm just going to continue whip stitching until my seam is 4 inches long from the beginning to wherever I stop. Alright, so I've made it to the point where my seam is about 4 inches long, so I can take one final stitch through the last place right here, wrap the yarn around the needle, and pull it through to make a knot. So now, of course, I would weave in this yarn tail and the one from the other seam, but just to show you how we're doing it, I'm going to leave the tails loose until I'm finished. So the final step is to take the tails on the other side and stitch up the other side seam, and then the other shoulder seam right across there, the same way that we did it on this side, and then our T will be finished. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you make this project, let me know how it turns out for you in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.